Hello and welcome to the first session of Posthuman Life taught by David Roden. This will be a four-part session where we'll investigate the first four chapters of David's book. So I'll pass it on to David and we can start.
Okay, thanks Tony, and welcome to everybody to our first session. I'm in Bristol at the moment in the UK. It's evening. I don't know where you all are. So yes, I should probably explain something about the design of these seminars and how they correspond to the book, and then after that I'm going to launch into a discussion of the central concepts of the book and the central arguments that it promulgates. So the aim of this session really is to provide a kind of geography of the main concepts, the main arguments that the book develops, and that hopefully will provide some context when we get down to focusing on some of the individual chapters in the following three sessions. So I'm aiming to talk, I don't know, approximately an hour. I don't know if that would be excessive. We can, and I'm quite happy to be interrupted as I go along, because there's no point me rattling over ideas or terms if you're unfamiliar with them. So do cut in if you want to, if you want me to explain something, and I'll do my best to explain it. I think I mean I was going to suggest that that you all at some point introduce yourselves, but as I know a few people are going to come in late, maybe we could do this after my initial presentation, and then we could launch into a discussion of some of the ideas, and you can ask me any further questions you want, or make any interventions you want. I mean, I think it should be said that all the ideas in posthuman life are very much in development. You know, the fact that the book's published doesn't mean that I'm not thinking about them and rethinking them. So I'd be incredibly grateful to hear any criticisms, any different perspectives that you have. So okay, without further ado, I'll launch into a discussion of a presentation of the key ideas. This has 5 parts. The first part, if Tony can flick to the second slide. The first part, humanism, transhumanism, and posthumanism, is really concerned with establishing the sort of key conceptual distinctions between particularly posthumanism and the various positions that it's sometimes conflated with. I also here I'm attempting to complicate the notion of posthumanism. So as we'll see, there are a number of different positions that I grouped under the generic term posthumanism. Among them, the position that I'm developing in posthuman life, which I call speculative posthumanism. And if you've read any of the book, you'll be aware of that. So okay, if we can go to the next slide. So here's a kind of generic, just a generic sort of account of what I understand by humanism. And one of the things I try to do in this book is to develop a kind of fairly abstract account of both of humanism and posthumanism in order to do justice to the various positions that can that can be grouped under those headings, and in order to give the exposition a bit of flexibility. So my conception of humanism is fairly schematic, and deliberately so. I say a philosopher is a humanist if she believes that humans are importantly distinct from non-humans, and supports this with some philosophical account of human non-human difference, what we call in the trade a philosophical anthropology. And it's kind of key to the argument of the book that I distinguish humanism from anthropocentrism. I mean, it's partly because I think they're sometimes conflated, but one can be a humanist without being anthropocentric. An anthropocentric position, or an anthropocentric humanism, is one that accords humans special honours in the world order. And there are various ways in which that can occur. And again, I draw that distinction quite abstractly so we can do justice to the various kinds of ways in which a philosophy or an ideological position can accord students human special status. Okay, so I guess the payoff from this is that generically posthumanism or posthumanisms are those positions which in some way or other critique or reject anthropocentrism. And that's not necessarily the same, as I emphasize, as rejecting humanism. In many ways, the position I develop in the book is humanist in the minimal sense. I think, yeah, I argue that humans are interestingly distinct from non-humans. But we can discuss this later, and it might be something that you want to follow through. Okay, next slide. Transhumanism. I don't discuss transhumanism extensively in the book, but I think it's important to address it early on, and I do. In part because the position that I'm articulating, speculative posthumanism, is intended to be a corrective to what I see as a somewhat distorted picture of the kind of long-term fate of life and of technology that transhumanists can sometimes present. So, okay, my bald again potted definition of transhumanism is a position according to which human nature can and should be altered through technological means. So, roughly speaking, transhumanists argue that we should use advanced technologies, or what are sometimes called the NBIC technologies, to improve human capacities and to enhance human flourishing. Okay, and if we go on to the next slide, I've just run through a list of the main technologies that are at issue here, the NBIC technologies: nanotechnology, biotechnology, information technology, cognitive science. It's probably a familiar list to some of you. Nanotechnology is concerned with developing new materials and new industrial processes using atom-scale manufacturing. Biotechnology is concerned with manipulating life at the genetic or subcellular level. Information technology is concerned with developing computation and also various kind of interfaces between computational and non-computational systems. And cognitive science is an umbrella term which covers areas like neuroscience, cognitive psychology, some parts of philosophy of mind, robotics, various other parts of artificial intelligence, which is concerned with understanding the structure and the implementation of mental processes. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is kind of a screwy and rather simplistic conception of what a humanist biopolitics or a humanist politics involves. Broadly, as I said, humanists believe that humans are interestingly different from non-humans, and most humanists believe that humans have various worthwhile, morally important capacities. For example, the capacity for autonomy, the capacity for rationality, the capacity to develop various kinds of moral virtues like courage or justice or friendship. And for the most part, humanists think these are cultivated through two very, relatively, well, you can argue with me about how reliable they are, but they're relatively reliable techniques: education and politics. So Aristotle argues that, yeah, we're not born virtuous; we're born with the capacity to acquire virtue, and you get virtue by being brought up right, by being taught good habits. So that's a fairly standard humanist position. Whereas if we go on to the next slide, transhumanist biopolitics. Yeah, so transhumanist biopolitics retains a commitment to various kinds of forms of education, politics, the development of culture, but transhumanists also think that the MBIC technologies that I've just mentioned have a role in inculcating these various cognitive and moral virtues. So obviously some transhumanists think we should use drugs or various kinds of interfaces to develop our cognitive powers, or to make us nicer, to make us more empathetic. I guess the take-home moral here, and I guess what I'm implying, is that the normative content of transhumanism is by and large not that much different from humanism. That if you read key transhumanist philosophers like, for example, Nick Bostrom or Max Moore, they're interested in developing human flourishing, developing the kinds of virtues and powers that humans already exhibit, but using various kinds of technological means to extend them beyond the current sort of constraints of our biology. So for transhumanists don't necessarily reject humanism, but they think that the aims of humanism can be, if you like, achieved by weaponizing the new technologies that seem to be in the process of developing to for example, to make us much smarter than our bare brains would currently allow, or to allow us to live far longer than conventional medicine and other treatments would have allowed in the past. And I think that goes with a fairly conventional sense of what future subjects are and ought to be. So if you value autonomy and if you value various kinds of social virtues like sympathy or empathy, you seem to be assuming that the results of transhumanist interventions will be not unlike us, but just better at being the kinds of creatures we are. So this is what I mean when I emphasize in the book that transhumanism is primarily a normative position. It obviously makes certain recommendations in the light of new discoveries in science and technology, but the ethical axis of transhumanism is arguably pretty much the kind of axis that we find in various kinds of humanisms, whether it's Aristotelian humanism or various kinds of modern humanism. Okay, can we get on to the next slide? I want to come on to posthumanism in the round. Great. So I guess the key distinction that I make in the beginning of the book is between critical posthumanism and speculative posthumanism. And a lot of the book, certainly at the beginning of the book and at the end of the book, is involved with a kind of reorientation or a kind of synthesis of these two positions. So broadly, and I think this is a point where a lot of you can kind of come back at me and maybe tell me I've been too bald and too simplistic. Critical posthumanists say that a lot of our modern intellectual life, a lot of our intellectual heritage, particularly our philosophical and political heritage, is anthropocentric. That is, it favours a certain conception of the human subject. It's oriented towards a certain kind of agent, and critical posthumanist interventions in the academic humanities, whether in literature, geography, art, philosophy, are concerned to, if you like, deconstruct and worry at that construction of the human agent, and to consider whether perhaps this conception of the agent has been excessively universalized. So, you know, Catherine Hales argues that our conception of the autonomous, self-governing human subject is actually derived from a very privileged power position, which isn't representative of the kinds of lives that most people live. And, you know, she may well have a point there. I mean, I guess at a more philosophical level, many critical posthumanists are concerned with undercutting the epistemological status of the human subject. For example, does the human subject or a certain conception of human subjectivity provide us with a ground for thinking about morality or for thinking about theory of knowledge? And I criticize certain elements of critical posthumanism, but broadly, one of the things I want to do with speculative posthumanism is develop a conception of the long-run future of life, and particularly the long-run development of technological life, which takes on board the idea that we've perhaps over-universalized certain conceptions of human subjectivity in a way that's precipitate, in a way that, in a sense, runs ahead of what we can actually know about the future. So if we could go on to the next slide. Okay, so really this is just reiterating what I've said, so you know we can move on soon. I've explained what I think humanism is at its bare bones level. A humanist is somebody who believes that there's a significant distinction between humans and non-humans. Now, not all distinctions between non-humans and humans arguably are philosophically significant. I mean, the fact that, you know, humans are hairless and many non-humans are hairy is, you know, arguably a not particularly significant difference. I guess the kinds of differences that humanists tend to emphasize are, as I've said, the idea that humans are, as Aristotle argued, are uniquely responsive to reason, are uniquely able to wield abstract concepts or concepts to core. Or are uniquely able to use language. But I want to suggest that there's, as I said, a difference between that and anthropocentrism. And the key generic account of posthumanism is that posthumanists by and large reject anthropocentrism. I mean, for a position to be posthumanist, it has to reject anthropocentrism. So if we go on to the next slide, I want to break that down. I've given you a generic characterization of posthumanism, but actually there are many different ways in which this, in which the critique and rejection of anthropocentrism can occur, arguably. And I think it's important to keep these in mind and not to conflate them. So I've just mentioned the position that posthuman life promulgates, speculative posthumanism, or sometimes shortened to SP, opposes human-centered thinking about the long-run implications of modern technology. Critical posthumanism is a broadly based attack on the supposed anthropocentrism of modern philosophy and intellectual life. But I've coupled those with two other positions that will be variously familiar, I guess, to you. Speculative realism and philosophical naturalism. Now, speculative realism, those of you who kind of follow the development of this new kid on the block of continental philosophy, is probably not a surprising addition to the roster of posthumanism, since a lot of speculative realists, a lot of the critical moves in speculative realist thought involve the rejection of a certain kind of privileging of the human viewpoint, in particular Kantian and post-Kantian subject-centered or language-centered accounts of reality. So the classic diagnosis of this obviously is in Quentin Meillassoux' After Finitude, where he castigates post-Kantian philosophy for its correlationism, for the idea that philosophy can only be concerned with the human-world relationship rather than with the world as it is independently of the way humans construct or experience the world. And I think that's, whatever one's position on Meillassoux, I mean, I think that's an interesting and fruitful diagnosis, and it's one that I try to take on board in posthuman life. In particular, because I want to argue that there are conceivable posthumans. Note conceivable, because I want to argue that there are actually no posthumans at the moment. So we're talking about entities that might or might not be possible, whose nature is so different from ours that we can't extend the kind of transcendental accounts of experience or the structure of subjectivity to them. But more on that later. Then finally, philosophical naturalism. Philosophical naturalists are also generally and varyingly critical of transcendental thought, although there's some variation there. So, for example, somebody like Ray Brassio, I think, is a good philosophical naturalist, also takes on board and wants to retain certain aspects of the transcendental tradition. But generally, philosophical naturalism accords a final epistemological authority to science. The basic position that naturalists articulate is that science has shown us that we can't philosophize from our armchairs. We can't understand the structure of reality simply through pure thought. We have to actually get out there, make observations, construct theories, test theories. So if philosophy is going to limn the structure of reality, if it's going to delineate the nature of reality, it has to follow the lead of science, and it has to accept the final epistemological authority of science. Okay, so next slide, please. I want to talk a bit about just some of the exemplary figures that we could associate with some of these positions. Much of the critical posthumanist literature, I think, has been influenced by Jacques Derrida's deconstructionist writings, although to pick out Derrida is in some way unfair, because figures like Deleuze and Lyotard are also very, very significant. but I guess in the literary side of deconstruction, literary side of critical posthumanism, there's still quite an important deconstructive input. So, for example, Catherine Hales, I think, in her seminal text, How We Became Posthuman, argues that Derrida shows that speech or language is a cyborg act, because one of Derrida's most important arguments is that the subject, the speaking subject, or the writing subject, is not in control of the meanings of the terms that of the inscriptions that they produce, because these inscriptions are always iterable, always repeatable in context, which escape any simple presence and any simple control by the speaking subject. And I think that's one of the points that's at issue in a quote that's actually from his essay Freud and the Scene of Writing, which also, interestingly, from the point of view of critical posthumanism, develops a reading of Freud's early scientific project, which has a kind of early kind of neural network model of the mind. But later in the essay, he writes, sort of riffing off Freud, that the subject of writing does not exist if we mean by that the sovereign solitude of the author. The subject of writing is a system of relations between strata, the psyche, society, the world. Within that scene, on that stage, the punctual simplicity of the classical subject is not to be found. That to some extent is already preparing the stage for later critical posthumanist accounts of the subject, particularly in the work of thinkers like Donna Haraway and her cyborg theory, where we're no longer thinking of subjects as fully autonomous entities in control of their actions and in control of their meanings, but complex systems that are embedded in environments whose meanings are to some extent at the mercy of those environments, and whose subjectivity is to some extent constituted by relations between bodies and societies and technologies. Okay, next slide, please. And then here's speculative realism. This is a quote from Graham Harman's book on Meillassoux. This is really just reiterating what I said about correlationism. Maybe we can move on actually to the next slide. Yeah, and this is Catherine Hales. This is really this is quite an important quote, I think, from her book How We Became Posthuman. The posthuman, she writes, does not really mean the end of humanity. It signals instead the end of a certain conception of the human, a conception that may once have applied at best to that fraction of humanity who had the wealth, power, and leisure to conceptualize them as autonomous beings. As I said, that's kind of one of the key critical axes of many critical posthumanist thinkers, and I'm not fundamentally opposed to it, but in contradistinction to Hales, speculative posthumanism does argue for a notion of the posthuman which, were it realized, would be the end of humanity. It would actually be an entirely different kind of system or creature. So I kind of want to make a dialectical intervention here. Next slide, please. This is a quote from James Ladyman and Don Ross's book, Everything Must Go, which is probably one of the key modern texts of philosophical naturalism. And I like it because it kind of boldly expresses the complete rejection of any kind of common sense thinking about the world, or any kind of idea that we could understand the world as from the point of view of what we as human beings could regard as rational. So they write, naturalism is, among other things, the metaphysical hypothesis that the objective world is not constrained by any reasons or standards of reasonableness. And I think this is an interesting speculative proposition to take on board when we're thinking of the far future, as well as when we're thinking about the nature of physical or non-human reality generally. Okay. Could we go on? Yeah. So now I want to sort of discuss in more detail what speculative posthumanism might entail, and in particular the kind of epistemological issues that it raises, because those are going to be key for much of this course, because the first part of posthuman life is in a way an attempt to establish a kind of epistemic void around the future, to, in a sense, strip our understanding of the future of as many anthropocentric assumptions as we can target. So yeah, so this, I guess Ladyman and Ross's statement is salutary when we're thinking about that. So one way to think about this, if we go to the next slide, is to think about one of these key transhumanist aims, which is immortality, and in particular immortality through the uploading of one's mind, of one's personality, of one's memory, one's consciousness perhaps, onto some much more robust, perhaps computational platform, which would allow one to perhaps live indefinitely, perhaps produce multiple copies of oneself in order to ramp up the odds of one surviving to the end of the universe, or maybe even beyond that. And I guess philosophically, the key idea behind mind uploading owes to a development in philosophy of mind and cognitive science that emerged in the 60s, and that's the idea of functionalism, and it's still a pretty big idea. I mean, a lot of thinkers within the kind of rationalist end of speculative realism are avowed functionalists. So what functionalists claim is that, crudely, for something to be a mental state is for that state to occupy a certain role, to have certain inputs and outputs. It doesn't matter, in a sense, what stuff that state is in a state is a state of, just so long as the inputs and outputs are of some appropriate kind. So, at a really simple level, one could think of pain as a pain state as involving certain inputs, like some detection of physical or tissue damage to the body, and certain kinds of outputs, such as making one's body avert from the source of the damage, giving rise to certain beliefs about what one needs to do to avoid the damage. And you could argue, if you're a functionalist, that, and this would be a very simplistic functionalism arguably, that any state which has those inputs and those outputs could count as a pain state. So even if it's a state in some silicon-based life form or a robot, as long as it has the requisite inputs, that is, there's some kind of process whereby damage to a system is detected, and some other process whereby aversion and various other kinds of useful beliefs are generated, then we've got a pain state. At a more abstract level, functionalists argue that the mind is an abstract causal structure, that essentially to have a mind is to have something like a human mind a system must replicate the causal structure of that mind at some level. Now, what level that is unclear. It might be, if you're a functionalist, the level of sort of individual neurons. So if you want to replicate a human mind, then you've got to replicate a system which has enough neuronal units in it, where each neuronal unit can occupy the same kinds of states that your neurons or my neurons occupy, and also where the causal dependencies between those neurons is pretty much the same as the causal dependencies between our neurons. Of course, in such a system, those dependencies might be mediated computationally rather than through dendrites and axons, so it might be non-biological, but essentially it would reproduce a kind of abstract causal structure. Now, if that was possible, and if functionalism is true, that is, if the mind is not being minded is not dependent on having a certain kind of biological or physical substrate, then one might hope to replicate individual minds on some more robust platform by replicating their abstract causal diagrams. And Catherine Hales, in How We Became Posthuman, has a nice passage where she's responding to just such a proposal, that of the roboticist Hans Moravec. She says, I was reading Hans Moravec's Mind Children, The Future of Robot and Human Intelligence, enjoying the ingenious variety of his robots, when I happened upon the passage where he argues that it will soon be possible to download human consciousness into a computer. To illustrate, he invents a fantasy scenario in which a robot surgeon purees the human brain in a kind of crazed cranial liposuction, reading the information in each molecular layer as it is stripped away and transferring the information into a computer. At the end of the operation, the cranial cavity is empty, and the patient, now inhabiting the metallic body of the computer, wakens to find his consciousness exactly the same as it was before. And here she expresses her incredulity. She hasn't actually got an argument, but her incredulity is itself interesting. How, I asked myself, was it possible for somebody of Moravec's obvious intelligence to believe that the mind could be separated from the body? Even assuming such a separation was possible, how could anyone think that consciousness in an entirely different medium would remain unchanged, as if it had no connection with embodiment? Shocked into awareness, I began to notice he was far from alone, as indeed he isn't. You know, many transhumanists hope at some point that we'll be able to achieve some kind of de facto immortality through mind uploading, and you know, that's treated as a desirable goal because conscious life is, and particularly human consciousness, is treated as something inherently valuable by transhumanists. But if we go on to the next page, I just want to bring up, I want to emphasize why Hales's point is, if you like, highlights the distinction between speculative posthumanism and transhumanism. Because just, as I said, I don't know if Hales is right, because I don't know if functionalism is false. I mean, maybe functionalism at some level is true. Maybe it's right that if you emulated a human brain at some grain, it may be at the level of the neuron, it's more likely to be at a much lower level in a computer, you would get something with an entity with all the psychological and phenomenological capacities that we have. That is, it would have some kind of working memory, some kind of ability to reason, some kind of capacity for sensory input, some kind of capacity for rational agency and consciousness. Maybe all that's true. But suppose she's right, and suppose the nature of minds is actually far more sensitive to the nature, to the way minds are embodied. So maybe suppose some kind of silicon mind is possible, it would just be radically different from any kind of mind we're aware of. Now, arguably for a transhumanist, that's bad news, because it means that that particular route for immortality is closed to us, at least insofar as we want to replicate minds that are something like our own. But from the point of view of speculative posthumanism, that's simply, well, in a way it's kind of good, because it ramps up the weirdness factor. It suggests that by varying the substrate of mind, we're actually varying the kinds of minds that could eventually be out there. And, you know, it may be then that if mind is intimately substrate dependent, then very strange forms of embodiment could give rise to very strange forms of subject or agent. So Hales's objection, if it's right, is bad news for at least some transhumanists, but it doesn't affect the claims of speculative posthumanism. And that highlights, I guess, a deeper philosophical claim that transhumanism, as I emphasize, is a normative or ethical position. It's a position about how what we ought to do with modern technology, or with emerging technology. Whereas speculative posthumanism is at bottom a metaphysical possibility claim. At root, it just says there could be posthumans. There could be non-human agents brought about through some kind of process of technological change, whereas where the resemblance of these creatures or these agents to humans or to humanoid agency is open to doubt or uncertainty. So, and I think that's that's one of the criticisms I level at some of the critical post-humanist writing on transhumanism, is not that they're not right to castigate some transhumanists for their naive anthropocentrism, but that they ignore the possibility of another kind of futurism, which wouldn't necessarily be anthropocentric at all. So it's almost as if you reject transhumanism. By rejecting transhumanism, you reject the legitimacy of speculating about the long-run fate of life and the long-run implications of modern technology. So if we go to the next slide. Oh, getting a...
Yeah, hello,
hi, Konstantin.
Hey, I had a question concerning the previous argument.
Sure.
This kind of weirdness factor. Do you think this could be applied, say, not in the subject, meaning the uploaded consciousness, which becomes another subject,
sure,
but also to the kind and the type of environment? Let's say a radical change or shift in the conditions that say, a human or another thing exists in.
Yeah, I think you're right, Konstantin. That's a really helpful point. I've been kind of focusing on minds and subjects, I guess because that's where a lot of the debate centers. But it's reasonable to suppose, firstly, that very different kinds of minds would produce very different kinds of environment. So I'm going to look in a moment at Werner Vinge's idea of the technological singularity, where he supposes that, for example, very advanced artificial intelligences might be so different from us that they would create a reality that's almost inconceivable for us, just as human reality is in some ways inconceivable to most kinds of non-humans. also, you know, there are debates within philosophy, within cognitive science and psychology about the interdependence of body and mind. So many within the embodied school of cognitive science and those who propose the extended mind thesis argue that much of what we call the mind actually takes place outside our skins. It takes place in culture, it takes place in our use of technology. So it's natural to think that, you know, that if that's right, then very different kinds of minds would automatically go with very different kinds of environment, because in the sense that those minds would be spreading out to their environments. The environments would be processes within the environments of those beings would be part of their mind. So there are at least two senses, I think, in which your question is your point is a very good one. You know, something we should bear in mind. You know, I'm making lots of simplifying assumptions. In fact, this talk is a whole series of, you know, simplifications, really, which it's kind of up to you lot to sort of break apart and chip away at. So thank you. So yeah, so the next slide. Okay, yeah. So in fact, this is perfect segue. Yeah, the singularity. This is just a quote from Werner Vinger's essay on this technological singularity. And I like it because it, unlike Ray Kurzweil's idea of the singularity, which I think is still kind of anthropocentric in a way, Vinger, perhaps because he's a science fiction writer, thinks that if it was possible for an artificial intelligence to, if we created an artificial intelligence that's roughly human equivalent or perhaps greater, he thinks it would then be possible for it to create an even smarter intelligence, since it would have at least a grasp of that technology. The technology would be improvable, and you get to the point where we'd have intelligent entities bootstrapping themselves exponentially way beyond current human levels, to the point really where we really can't, we can no more imagine what that world would be like than, you know, rats or mice can imagine what justice or propositional reasoning is like, or public transport for that matter. So if we go on to the next slide, which is my first kind of potted formulation of speculative posthumanism, the singularity thesis is, if you like, one possible instance, or describes one mechanism whereby current humans or current human technology could give rise to inhuman agents via a process of technological alteration. And note that I use the term alteration rather than enhancement. The problem with the term enhancement is that it's kind of a loaded term. When you enhance a function, you improve that function. But in many cases, when you introduce a new technology, you don't simply improve a preceding technology or extend a previous function, you introduce new functions. So writing is not just a better way of speaking, for example. So the term alteration is really just allows me to be as value neutral as possible about the nature of this technological change. So that's a kind of informal statement of speculative posthumanism. There's a slightly more formal one coming up. And if we go to the next slide, and then actually the next, because I'm going to, we're running out. I don't want to burn up too much time. So the next bit of this talk, and I don't really want to go much beyond. I don't know what you think, but I don't want to go talk much beyond 10 past 10, because I want to allow a bit of discussion and chat. Okay, so next slide, please. So this section's about as I say, it's about bounding what I call post-human possibility. This is a crummy attempt to get over a kind of abstract idea that I introduce in chapter 3 of Posthuman Life, The Edge of the Human, that I call posthuman possibility space. And it's essentially a very abstract concept. Posthuman possibility space is the set of all feasible routes whereby posthumans could emerge, the set of feasible posthuman itineraries. And one of the key claims I want to make, and in some ways it's a kind of blindingly obvious one, is we don't know what's in it. Okay, if we accept if we accept the notion of posthuman that I'm developing, that is some kind of non-human descendant of current humans, since there aren't any around at the moment, we've got no empirical basis for saying what belongs to a posthuman possibility space. You know, there are some, I mean, if we look at science fiction, if we look at movies like The Terminator, or novels like Neuromancer, or Charles Stross's Accelerando, which I discuss at some length in chapter 4, there are all sorts of interesting and deeply weird and fascinating accounts of what posthumans might be like. So, you know, arguably Skynet in the Terminator movies is a pretty good candidate for posthuman status. It's not human. It's in no way human. It's certainly it's historically descended from human technology, but it cuts out on its own. You know, it's not a particularly nice kind of posthuman, but it's a posthuman. But do we know whether beings like Skynet could be in posthuman possibility space? Well, that depends whether something like a digital computer could be a conscious agent. And we don't really know that, whether a digital computer could be a conscious agent yet. It might be, it might not be. So, you know, there's a question mark over whether digital computers could be posthumans. There seem to be certain kinds of posthumans, or certain conceivable posthumans that are just impossible, that don't belong to PPS. So, for example, one might imagine, you know, something like a magical Dark Lord like Sauron in Lord of the Rings arising through some sort of human magical technology. But assuming that magic is impossible in our kinds of universe, then posthumans like Sauron, or Sauron-like, or Sauronish, yeah, basilisks, I don't know. Maybe posthuman basilisks are possible through some sort of horrible genetic intervention. I don't know. But the point is, yeah, well, you know, for me, it's anything with too many legs, basically, suckers, you know. But that's the idea. So posthuman possibility space is just an abstract. It's an abstract structure. It may be empty. That is, you know, it might be that, you know, I'm gassing on about beings that couldn't exist here in any possible world, or at least any world like ours. Or it may be thronging with all sorts of weird stuff. But the point is that weird stuff hasn't arrived yet. So there are issues about how we can know what's in posthuman possibility space, and by extension, since posthumans are or would be, were they to arise, a consequence of some iteration of our own technical activity, it means there's some doubt about what we're getting ourselves into by being tied to this massive, evolving, changing, fast-changing technological system. That's, I guess, where speculative posthumanism starts to become ethically relevant. So as I've emphasized, speculative posthumanism itself is not an ethical position. It's not like transhumanism in that sense. It doesn't say what we ought to do, but it might well have implications for what we ought to do or not do. So to the next slide, this really just summarises what the question I've just asked. What, if any, constraints can we apply to post-human possibility space? And if we can't know what's going to be in PPS empirically yet, since post-humans there are none, an interesting philosophical question is whether there are a priori constraints. That is, constraints we can kind of discover from our armchairs or in our Google Hangouts on the content of PPS. Because, and if that was the case, that would be interesting and salutary in all sorts of ways. Because if, as I'm claiming, that posthumans would be our technological descendants, if there are constraints on the kinds of technological descents there could be that we can discover now through some kind of a priori reasoning, then we can get a clearer sense perhaps of what we're getting ourselves into by being this dependent on technology and by allowing the kind of rampant development of, for example, technologies like artificial intelligence or nanoscale engineering. So this leads, in a sense, to two broad positions which are kind of important really for the whole arc of the book and for the whole argument. So the distinction between, if we go to the next slide, it's a distinction between two kinds of speculative posthumanism, sorry. The first kind I call anthropologically bounded posthumanism, and that's, I suppose, the shortest way of characterizing that is to say that anthropologically bounded posthumanism, or APB, is speculative posthumanism plus some transcendental philosophy, some kind of transcendental account of what agents must be. So I've kind of put it in the form that an analytic philosopher might. So APB holds that there are unique constraints on cognition, mind, agency. So, and assuming that posthumans would be agents of some kind, they'd have to then satisfy these constraints. And it, the point is that if some kind of transcendental philosophy is a live option or is true, then we ought to be able to discover what those constraints are by thinking about, for example, the necessary conditions for subjectivity, for conceptual thought, for agency, the kind of Kantian, essentially following through the Kantian and post-Kantian perspectives for philosophy. So, for example, if Kant is right and agents must be concept users of some kind, and concepts are rules, as Kant argues, then whatever posthumans would be out there, they would have to be capable of some kind of rule-governed thinking. And that becomes interesting in the light of some contemporary analytic post-Sellers philosophical positions, the kind of position that we see in the work of Robert Brandom, obviously Sellers, and obviously Ray Brassier, where it's argued that genuine agency and genuine conceptual thinking is only possible for beings capable of language, capable of internalizing the proprieties of rule-governed thought through language and through some kind of social existence. But that may not be the only kind of anthropologically bounded posthumanism that's possible, but it's one kind. And here's an example of an argument that, the next slide, that I owe to Donald Davidson. And we can look at this in more detail. It's probably too detailed for this talk, but the basic idea, Davidson develops it in his essay Thought and Talk, which I look at in chapter 3, is that to have a belief, right, to have any kind of intentional state, Davidson argues, you have to be capable of belief. You have to be, as Dan Dennett might say, a true believer. You couldn't have belief, you couldn't have desires without beliefs. You couldn't have intentions without beliefs. So what do you need to have a belief? Well, Davidson argues that to have a belief, you need to have a concept of belief. You need, because being a believer involves holding certain statements to be true or certain propositions to be true. And to understand truth, one needs to understand the possibility of being mistaken. And one can only do that if one can understand that other creatures or oneself could be mistaken. And to have that understanding, one needs to be a believer. One needs a concept of belief. So according to Davidson, and I think Brandom and other things extend this idea, the only kinds of creatures that really have proper beliefs are those that are capable of, if you like, reflecting on their beliefs. And that, according to Davidson and according to some other thinkers, requires language, because language provides, if you like, a common code, a common currency within which to interpret one another and to ascribe beliefs. But we can come back to that next time. So if we can go on to the next page. This is a quote from Darrell Wennemann's, I think, very good book, Posthuman Personhood. And Wennemann, if you like, develops this kind of Kantian position on the posthuman. For him, the only kinds of posthumans that are possible are posthuman moral agents, very much like humans. That is, beings capable of reflecting upon themselves in some kind of communal context. So he writes, in a posthuman age, the moral community is constituted by all beings of a kind that are capable of moral reflection and thus agency. Human beings are one such kind, but there may be others. But the point is, if Wennemann's right, and if anthropologically bounded posthumanism of some form is right, then whatever posthumans are like, they would have to be moral agents much like us. But if we go to the next slide, there's another position which is, I guess, slightly more disturbing in its implications. That's what I call anthropologically unbounded posthumanism. AUP argues that we really at its baldest, AUP argues that there are no discoverable transcendental constraints, that is, or a priori constraints on posthuman possibility space. We have no way of knowing what's in posthuman possibility space ahead of actually bumping up against it or making it or becoming it. So according to AUB, which is the position I argue for, that's probably, I guess, the focus of Chapter 4. Chapter 3 is kind of setting up anthropologically bounded posthumanism of various forms. Chapter 4 is an attempt to kind of deconstruct it, to argue against it. That's the position I argue for this book, and it's a position I'm still arguing for. I'm not sure that all the arguments in posthuman life are satisfactory. But if that's right, and I think it's a position that's shared at least by my friend Scott Backer, the science fiction writer and philosopher. If that's right, then in a sense, posthuman possibility space from our perspective is a void. We really don't know what's in it, and we may or may not be coming up against it. And we can kind of debate the moral implications and political implications of that. I think Backer's more pessimistic about them than me, but that's the upshot. Why should we believe AUP rather than ABP? That is, why should we believe that posthuman possibility is not anthropologically bounded? Well, there are various routes to this argument, various routes to that conclusion. I argue in chapter 4 for the existence of something called dark phenomenology. Again, we can look at that in more detail in the final session, but the rough outline of that argument is that much of our phenomenology is such that we have no insight. That much of our conscious experience, the structure of our experience, is inaccessible to us from a first-person angle. We have it, but simply having it doesn't give us insight into it, and that means we've got no phenomenological or first-person basis for making claims about what kinds of subjects could be possible, because we don't really know what kinds of subjects we are. And then the next kind of argument, next slide, is an argument from conceivable weird posthumans, particularly for something I call a hyperplastic entity, an entity that's capable of modifying itself, modifying its functional physical structure in an arbitrary degree. And I argue that, yeah, a hyperplastic entity wouldn't be the kind of creature that we could situate in a linguistic space of reasons. But I don't want to harp on about that here. It's just one of the, and if that's right, if hyperplastic entities are possible, then we're in no position to, we can't conceive, we can't think of, it makes no point, there's no, sorry, I'll start again, I'm talking too fast. If hyperplastic entities are possible, then we can't conceive of them along the lines of rational subjects that we can situate in a linguistically structured space of reasons. That's the upshot of that argument. It's not as developed in the book as it might be, but I've been trying to develop it elsewhere. We can come back to that and look at some of what I've written afterwards. So next slide is the third reason for rejecting anthropological bounded posthumanism is a critique of certain kinds of analytical pragmatism, which I pepper this critique throughout the book, and I think it could have been better formed and better stated, but it's probably more developed in a piece I wrote subsequently on Brandon called Spectral Machines, which is coming out in the proceedings of the Philosophy After Nature conference in Utrecht, and that's available on Academia Edu. So if you ever want to look at it, but the basic structure of that argument is that most of these pragmatist positions depend on some idea of interpretability or interpretation. That roughly a pragmatist account of social practice requires some account of what a social practice is, and I think that pragmatists don't really have a better account of what social practice is than to say that something is a social practice if we or some ideal interpreter would interpret it as a social practice. However, if the stuff I've been talking about in relation to dark phenomenology is right, then I want to argue that the notion of this ideal interpreter or interpretability in principle is massively underdefined. So we don't, and if that's right, then however intuitively appealing that position might be, we don't really have, it doesn't give us a handle on possible agents, on possible minds. Okay, so we're now on to part 4, where I'm kind of, next slide, so conceptualizing human post-human difference. So what I've described up to now is the kind of, as I said, the opening up of the void, the opening up of the kind of epistemological space of the book, and the argument in favor of an unbounded posthumanism. And that's going to, there's quite a lot of stuff that needs to be teased apart and questioned there, and that's I suspect, going to take up a lot of our time. But just to get a sense of where this is heading, and in a sense where we go beyond that into the more constructive side of the book, I want to talk a bit about how I conceive of how I articulate speculative posthumanism and how I articulate human posthuman difference. So here's a slightly more formal and pregnant statement of speculative posthumanism. Again, I hope it's simple, but there are a number of terms in it that I've written in orange, which require unpacking, which require explanation. So I say that according to speculative posthumanism, wide descendants, so this is a loaded term, of current humans could cease to be human, and ceasing to be human again is a loaded concept, by virtue of a history of technical alteration. So what, I guess that raises the question, well, what do I mean by wide descendant? What, why even introduce this term? And what, above all, do we mean by ceasing to be human? If we go to the next slide, I've got a kind of a definition of wide human descent. But before going through that, yeah, I mean, I guess I want to talk a little bit about ceasing to be human, and it relates to a question I was asked just before the course began in an interview. I don't know if it's up on the net yet because there were sound problems, but it relates to an obvious objection, I guess, to speculative posthumanism that would come perhaps from a critical posthumanist position. That is, well, in a sense, if we deconstructed the human, if in a sense we no longer believe that there are transcendental or invariant features of humanity that we can point to as a basis for our ethics or our politics or whatever, then how can we possibly talk about the posthuman since we don't know what the human is? And that's something I take very seriously. Perhaps then there is no such thing as human nature. There's no human essence. And if there's no human essence, then what the hell are we doing here talking about posthumans? So I'll come to that shortly, and I guess it's something we may want to plug away at as well in discussion. So yeah, the definition of wide human sorry, if we go back, sorry, by wide human descent, I'm trying to get at the idea that the descendants by descendants of humans, we can't simply mean biological descendants of humans, because the proposal is that posthumans would come about by some kind of technological means. We don't necessarily know how. Therefore, we can't limit the sort of historical succession relation that links humans and posthumans to the biological, to purely biological reproduction. It might involve that, or it might involve some other kind of arbitrarily technologically mediated process. So wide human descent is simply trying to get at that yeah, posthumans might be biological descendants from us in some ways, but they might also be technological descendants. So there might be a sense in which, say, if artificial intelligence is possible in some way that would be relevant to posthumanism, the artificial intelligence, highly intelligent AIs, would be descendants of us, but they wouldn't be descendants of us biologically, they'd be descendants of our kind of technological infrastructure. So I've introduced this notion of the wide human, and the wide human is simply a socio-technical system of which we're a part. It's what we call or sometimes called an assemblage. We're part of that system, but also our institutions are part of it. Our things like public transport systems, factories, sewage systems, all sorts of technological systems are part of it. Our environment, and go back to Konstantin's question, our environments, human-created environments are part of it. It's, in a sense, the whole human footprint on the planet, including all our institutions, our culture, and it's simply to get at the idea that whatever posthumans would be, they would come about, they would derive from some part of this much more extended system. I think another good reason for thinking in these terms is that, you know, it's arguable that in any case that a lot of the features we associate with humanity, such as reason, reflection, language, are only possible within the wide human. So we're arguably embedded within the wide human, just as the wide human is arguably dependent on us. I mean, if all the humans, biological humans on the planet disappeared, then the wide human wouldn't function for very long. It would just stop. You know, the buildings would crumble. You know, transport systems wouldn't work. The power would stop. So at the moment, the wide human system is intimately dependent on us, just as we are intimately dependent on it. That may change. So next page, please. This is really the core of the book, the disconnection thesis. So the disconnection thesis is simply a very formal, abstract specification of what it takes to be posthuman. And the rough and ready potted summary of that is that a posthuman is any entity which perhaps has, through some process of technological change, has at some point ceased to belong to the wide human. It's kind of cut out on its own. So if we were capable, I mean, currently, you know, no robot is capable of existing outside the human technical system, at least not for very long. You know, it would run out of power. But if we were capable of if we made an autonomous robot that was capable of kind of fueling up independently and capable of discovering its own way around the world, then, you know, that might qualify as a posthuman. So a posthuman, in a sense, is any descendant of part of the wide descendant of ours that is capable of going feral, rather in the way that domesticated animals can cut out on their own. And any wide descendant of a posthuman will also be posthuman as long as it stays outside the wide human. So that's, I want to emphasize just how abstract that is, how uninformative it is. It tells us absolutely nothing about posthumans beyond the fact that they'd have to be some kind of agent and something independent of us, of the wide human. Okay. I want to pause a bit here just in case there are, because some of you might want a break, because I've been talking a long time and you've been listening a long time. Does anyone want a break? 10-minute break? Let's do.
We can have a break. It's fine.
Yeah.
It's 6:20 Eastern Standard, so I come back in 10 minutes.
Yeah, that might be an idea, just to rest or whatever, and we'll come back in 10 minutes, and I can talk a little more, and then we can discuss things hopefully. Okay, cheers, Tony.
All right. Be back soon. I'm ready when you are.
Okay, is everyone back? Or,
I think everybody but Petra, maybe.
yeah, Samuel is back.
Yeah,
Yeah, hi
everybody.
Petra. Hi, great. Okay, I suppose before I continue, I mean, I don't know. We've got about an hour left, and I'm sort of wondering how many questions people have at this stage. I could talk a bit more about the kind of ontological assumptions around the disconnection thesis, notions of agency, and perhaps project forwards a bit to the kind of some of the political issues that it raises. But I don't know if at this point people just want to interject, or they're kind of burning questions.
Look, for me, I'm just moving along with you, and I'm gathering all this amazing stuff you're presenting. So I don't know.
Okay, I mean, as I said, I was just saying to my partner that it may sound like I like the sound of my own voice, but kind of I find it quite unbearable at times. So I usually assume that other people want to chip in.
Okay, one thing I could say as a remark probably so far, and I haven't read the book. It's still shipping.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, that's
Okay.
kind of what I'm assuming, that people haven't necessarily read it.
But I've sensed somehow some kind of danger of agnosticism, some kind. All this um, ambiguity between not knowing what and
Yeah,
not knowing how, and somehow this is the thought in a general sense. But I found the term white human is very explicative for many things. So yes.
yeah. I mean, I guess the notion of the wise human, in some ways, is an attempt to get around the objection that we don't have a kind of definition, a neat definition of what humans are. There's no, and that's probably correct. I mean, not all humans are, I mean, not all humans may be rational. Not all humans may be able to use language. Any species is, if you like, a swarm of different entities with different properties. So there may be no one thing that binds all human beings together, but so you can think of humans as a kind of population, but as a population, it has certain powers, certain capacities, and it depends on there being a sort of sprinkling of certain kind of capacities within it. So in a way, I'm thinking of the human as a kind of lump, as a kind of something with a historical reality that's been around for at least 2 million years, which is changing. So we don't really need an essence of the human to say what what being post-human would be like, or at least that's the claim. I think the issue of agnosticism is interesting, and I'm quite sensitive to that. The danger of agnosticism might be ethical, perhaps, that by withdrawing from any claim about what the post-human might be like, we're undermining our ability to make make ethical claims about what we're doing now. That may be the worry, that the post-human is so indeterminate that, in a sense, almost nothing we can do now, short of making a post-human, can actually settle any political or ethical questions about how we ought to use technology, for example. yeah, I can see why that might be a problem. I guess my response would be that could be an important objection, but the problem is that a lot of speculative claims about the future, and particularly among transhumanists and other futurists, have arguably made a lot of anthropocentric assumptions that may not be warranted. And if we're going to philosophize about the future, then we ought to be clear about what we can know about it before the future arrives. And that may not be very much. And if that's the case, then we at least, and if we could, and if that's true, then it's important that we know that, you know, rather than make assumptions about the future that aren't warranted. I don't know if that's a good response.
Well, that's an excellent response, because I just said, two words, and you're forced
Yeah.
to speak 2 paragraphs probably. But
Sorry.
No, it's okay. I mean, that was great, and I agree. I mean, I also quite polemic, let's say, theoretically, about any kind of human nature or any kind of essentializing anything. And I had many conversations, and mainly political, the previous years with friends or whatever.
Yeah.
But and I just said this phrase, danger of agnosticism, some kind of slippage that we are uncertain about anything for the future, and not for the human that was there in the Renaissance, for example, and the values that it had.
Yeah. I think Scott Bakker has an interesting position on this, and it comes out in an interview with me that I think should be coming out in Bigger Ground magazine in over the summer, and he argues that the posthuman is likely to be really bad, in the sense that it will simply erase anything of ethical value from the world. I mean, I'm simplifying his position, but he thinks that the posthuman, will just be the end of meaning, the end of morality, because it'll be the point at which we see that all these things are in fact illusory, and our technologies, particularly neuroscience and the technologies that may develop from that, will actually erase the kind of beings that could think that there's value in the world, or that certain kinds of life could be worth living. And if that's right, then we ought to be very worried, I suppose. But I guess being agnostic about the posthuman, or at least I think being alive to the possibility that we don't know what the posthuman is, even though we have reason to think there could be posthumans, allows that there could be posthuman states that are quite attractive. I don't know. I mean, I think this is a really difficult issue, because if we don't know what posthumans are like, then we don't know what kinds of values they will have, and what it will be like to be them. So how are we to make an assessment about whether we want to be them? I mean, that's something I'm trying to address. I try to address at the end of the book, and it's still something I'm trying to think through. But it's worth flagging up here, I think. We'll come to that anyway. Okay. Does anyone have any other questions? Otherwise, I can just keep on talking at you. It's okay. I had a load of black coffee before we started, so I'm good to go. Right. Okay, so that's the disconnection thesis. Just coming back to the earlier point. What does so what I want to talk about now is what the disconnection thesis entails in the, because I've suggested already that the disconnection thesis is hugely abstract, it's hugely uninformative. I think all I want to claim about it is that it at least gets to one of the key moral concerns that we have about the posthuman. I'm getting something from Annika, but I don't know what I just did.
That's just a mistake.
Sorry, Annika. Yeah, I'm feeling my way through this interface as well. So
yeah, that's to take
it's good to sort of press things and then just see what happens. Destruction test it. We should destruction test all our technology, including Google Hangouts, I guess. Yeah, so the point is, the disconnection thesis is abstract, but yeah, they will be available. I'll post them up because I realise they're kind of hard to follow, possibly in this environment. There's as much for my benefit as for yours, to be honest. So the disconnection thesis is abstract, but I think it gets at the core of one of our worries about the posthuman is that the posthumans will be the result of what we do, but they'll be independent of us in some way. They'll be out of our control. They'll be agents. I mean, I guess, if we go back to Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, the Frankenstein myth is, if you like, the archy-posthuman myth. It's the creation of something that we can't control, and that perhaps has needs and moral values that are different from ours, regardless of whether we approve of those values or whether they're values that we might want to sign up to. It's the idea of something radically different from the human that perhaps also has a degree of power and independence from us. So I think what I would claim is that it captures that concern in abstract form without being too committed to any particular avatar of the posthuman. I'm not saying, since we don't know whether digital computers, for example, can have human equivalent or superhuman intelligence, it's perhaps not a good idea to commit ourselves to visions of a future dominated by Skynet or beings like Skynet. So in a sense, there's some value, I think, to recognizing what we don't know and to formulating our ideas about the future in a way that cover as many of the important possibilities as we can. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the implications of the disconnection thesis. The first is the kind of this is in a sense something that I developed in the book. It's an ontological claim. I could probably be criticised from this, and I know Scott Backer thinks I've gone too far, or perhaps created too many hostages to fortune doing this. I use a lot of Manuel Delander's ideas, his version of assemblage theory, which is itself derived from Gilles Deleuze and Guattari's work, to formulate some of the key ideas behind underlying the disconnection thesis, and that's particularly the idea that the wide human is an assemblage. It's a system with certain kinds of interesting emergent properties, with certain components which can change over time. And one offshoot of that is that the ontology underlying the disconnection thesis is flat. It's not concerned with abstractions. It's concerned with relations between historical particulars. So if posthumans emerged at some point, this would be an event where a particular human culture would be faced by some kind of posthuman culture. But since we'd be talking about a relationship between two historically situated systems. How those would interact, we don't know in advance, because there aren't any posthumans. And so the restriction to talking about particular entities is in part a way of unpacking our ignorance and a way of avoiding the assumption that there are certain abstract structures, abstract properties, abstract conceptual demands upon the posthuman. So it's part of this anthropologically unbounded epistemology. Another point is that disconnection, as I say, or the process of disconnection, is multiply realizable. The idea of multiple realization goes back, first introduced in relation to functionalist philosophy of mind. That is, if it's the case that being a mental state, for example, is just a matter of having certain inputs and outputs, of instantiating a particular causal diagram, then anything which instantiates that causal diagram is a mental state. So the idea is you could have humans obviously having mental states, but you could also have robots, you could have silicon-based life forms, and they could all have beliefs or pains or toothaches, just so long as they've got the right, they've got some states in them that have the right kinds of inputs and outputs. So that's one idea of multiple realizability, that mental states could be multiply realized, because to be a mental state is simply to occupy a role, and different kinds of stuff or different kinds of physical states could occupy the same roles. So, you know, you could have human pain, octopus pain, Martian pain, perhaps even ghosts could have pain, as long as they have the right kind of causal structure. So that's one idea of multiple realization, which comes out of analytic philosophy of mind. But I think it's a claim I'd also want to make about disconnection, because there are just many different ways in which disconnection could conceivably occur. And that really arises from the very abstract specification that I've introduced. Yeah, that's an interesting question from Petra there. Questions for Q&A portion. Is it currently possible for technology to go feral? Yeah, I don't know. Maybe. Are there feral computer viruses? Maybe we could discuss that. You know, it'd be an interesting way of pooling our knowledge.
I'm in a coffee house. Is it really loud if I turn my mic on?
Yeah, I can hear you.
You're fine.
Okay.
Yeah, fine.
Okay, so what about the example that I listed, like plastics and the Pacific trash vortex? Like,
that's really nice. Yeah, yeah. So these are things, at least, which we've made that are kind of doing stuff. I mean, this is, I think, Graham Harman, sort of object-oriented philosophy would like that. They've got their own life. They're doing their own thinging, sort of in great drifts in the sea. Yeah. I've got an argument against that, and that crudely, it's that whatever posthumans are, they've got to be agents. And I'm not clear that a plastic lump is an agent.
Okay, I see.
We could argue about that, because it's an interesting point to discuss. One of the things I try to develop in the book is a very abstract account of what an agent is. I don't know if it's successful. It's just, at least all I can say is that I tried. But otherwise, the danger is that almost anything that we make that we cease to use could be posthuman, like some rusting ship. A hulk could be a posthuman, or a ruin. Hulks and ruins would be posthuman, and that doesn't. That might, I don't know. That's perhaps quite a poetic thought, but it's not a very, from the point of view of the position I'm developing the book, it's not a very interesting one, because, yeah, so what? it's not getting at at what we're really worried about, which is the things that have a similar level of power and ability to discover their own values to us. But
okay, so
that's a useful question.
When you say feral, this is
it's a metaphor,
right, and it's being applied specifically in the argument that you're making to agents of some kind.
Of some kind.
Some kind. Okay.
But
okay.
I guess a question that we can come back to this, although it's really taken up in chapter 6, but in a sense it's haunting all this discussion. What do we mean by an agent? It's actually, that's kind of a philosophically substantial question, which I'm, as I said, I'm not sure that the position I've developed is the right one, but I think it's worth at least raising, and if the book has any virtue, it's that it raises it in the context of this discussion. So
thanks for
but thanks for asking it, because I think that's a really helpful thing to table. Okay, the third point I've said that the ontology of the disconnections thesis is flat insofar as it concerns particulars rather than abstract properties. It's multiply realizable insofar as far as we know, there could be many different ways in which a disconnection could occur, and many ways that perhaps we can't even conceive of that they might occur. So all the disconnection thesis gives us is an abstract, if you like, diagram, an abstract specification of the posthuman, doesn't tell us what posthuman life would be like. And thirdly, this is perhaps the most speculative claim, that disconnections are liable to be diachronically emergent. And by that I mean very hard to predict. That is that it seems at least plausible to claim that it would be very hard for us to predict how a disconnection would pan out without actually being involved in one, but simply because of a number of factors, partly because we'd be dealing with kinds of thing that haven't existed before, so we can't really refer to previous sort of regularities in nature. We may be dealing with very complex computational systems, and we already know that even quite simple computational systems can behave unpredictably. So that's all I mean by diachronically emergent. I'm not talking about spooky emergence, like woo-woo, kind of what used to be called woo-woo West Coast emergence, whereby some philosophers, for example, think that consciousness is emergent insofar as it arises from physical causation, but is not itself physical in some way. I'm not committing myself to that kind of emergence, although it may occur. I mean emergence in the sense of processes that can't be predicted short of running them, and that's the key claim. Again, that's probably an area which could be developed. Okay, so actually the next couple of slides this is kind of, the next couple of slides are kind of responding to your question, Petra. Again, this is probably too complicated, but what do I mean by an agent? Well, this is a kind of rough summary. I think I look to the life sciences, particularly really in trying to develop a notion of an agent, and the kind of the rough intuition is that whatever counts as an agent has to be something, a system with lots of exquisitely interdependent processes, just as living things like ourselves have lots of interdependent processes, such that if any of those processes go wrong, then the whole system breaks down. So if if somebody cuts off the air to your lungs, then other things start going wrong. If, for example, you're not getting enough blood in your lungs, then your lungs aren't going to be able to take in enough oxygen. You're going to start, fluid's going to start building up in them. It's going to get, you're going to start feeling unwell. If various forms of fluid transport don't work in your body, if nutrients don't get to your bones and your muscles, you're going to start to die. So most living things seem to involve lots of exquisitely interdependent processes, and those processes depend on certain things, states of the environment as well as states of the organism, including each other. So, if you're teleported out into space, you stop breathing, so you die. So your respiration depends on oxygen. So oxygen is so what I want to say is oxygen is a value for that function of respiration. Yeah, I suppose, well, high-speed stock trading requires, it requires an infrastructure. I'm not sure if high-speed is an interesting debate about whether the kinds of systems, algorithms involved in stock trading are agents in the sense that I'm using it. But they're certainly computational agents, and it makes perfect sense to talk about, for example, multi-agent simulation in computer science. But yeah, the basic idea is that whatever posthumans are, they be some kind of self-maintaining system that roughly approximating a biological system, although they may not be made out of the same things that biological systems are made out of, although they may. And if we just get on to the next slide, because I don't want to go too deep there, I think that, because it's not one of the chapters we'll be looking to in detail, but the kind of, sorry, if we go back to the earlier slide, what is posthuman agency? The key point is I argue that an agent needs to exhibit a certain kind of autonomy, not necessarily moral autonomy, but it has to be able to enlist values. That is, it has to have functions that are maintaining it, processes that are maintaining it, which depend on certain values, and it also has to be able to be valuable for other things. And one way of thinking about that is that a functionally autonomous system is one that can find values in the world, but it can also be valuable. And being valuable means slotting into other systems. So it might mean, if you're talking about some kind of symbiotic organism, it might be providing functions that the other organism depends on, like food or protection, something like that. If you're a human being, it might mean being a parent, holding down a job, being a political agent. And the more flexibility you have in sort of slotting into these systems, the more functionally autonomous you are, or the more able you are to discover new values. For example, exploiting mineral resources, the more functionally autonomous you are. So there's a kind of functional autonomy is something that can come in degrees, and arguably, human beings perhaps have quite a lot of it, and perhaps posthumans would have to have quite a lot of it to kind of cut free of us. So, they're intuitively, functional autonomy is a bit like power, but it's the kind of power you need to have just to be an agent. It's not necessarily power that you have to exert on anyone. And I'm kind of making an amateurish sort of reference perhaps here to some of the political ideas in Deleuze and Guattari and some Spinozist political philosophy, although I'm not really qualified to talk about Spinoza. I'm sure you're all better versed in Spinoza than I am, but this idea that, yeah, being an agent involves having a certain kind of power, being able to find things, find values and be valuable, to slot into systems, to have a certain kind of flexibility, to a certain kind of ability to form affiliations in the world, and to, you know, in a sense, perhaps discover new forms of embodiment, new forms of agency, new forms of value. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to summarize, at least hint at some of the ethics of this. Okay, go to the next slide. Yeah. So one of the ideas I introduced in chapter 5, which is the same chapter I introduced, the disconnection thesis, is a kind of schematic moral claim, is that, well, if suppose as I said, speculative posthumanism is a metaphysical claim about what's possible. It's not as I said, an ethical claim. But if what I've been saying is right, then if posthumans are possible, then very powerful non-human agents are possible. That is, agents that are something like as flexible as us, not necessarily kind of godlike. You know, as I said, we don't know what posthumans would be like yet, because I don't know any, not personally. But if the possibilities claim is true, then there is at least some element of concern that we ought to have. It might be that because we're interested in becoming posthuman, or we're interested in avoiding the creation of posthumans. But at least there's some element of moral concern that should arise when we're thinking about the possible agents. So we got that gives us the first premise of an argument. We have an interest in understanding posthumans because we have an interest in understanding what the hell we're getting ourselves into in creating the kinds of technologies that could bring them about. Now, if we've got an interest in understanding anything, we've got an interest in getting into situations where we can understand that thing. So, you know, certain situations are more ideal than others when it comes to understanding stuff. So, you know, if you're on a planet in which there's never any night, then you're not in an ideal state to start doing astronomy. And similarly, if there are no posthumans around, then you're not in an ideal situation for understanding what posthuman life would be like, beyond the purely abstract stuff I've presented so far. So it seems to follow that the existence of posthumans is necessary for understanding posthumans in any substantive way. But if it's the case that the existence of posthumans is ideal for understanding them, and we've got an interest in understanding posthumans, it seems to follow that we've got an interest in bringing about the existence of posthumans, because that's the best way to understand them. But of course, if we've got a moral concern initially about the nature of posthumans and about the potential threats or potential awfulness or goodness, we don't know yet, then we seem to have reached an impasse, because we want, the reason why we want to understand posthumans is we want to understand the kinds of situations we might be getting into by creating them. But it seems that the only way we can substantively understand posthumans is by creating them, which could be to get ourselves into the very mess that we wanted to avoid in the first place. So there's a kind of, I don't know, deconstructionists would call it an aporia. Analytic philosophers might call it a screw-up. A kind of problem about understanding posthuman life if everything I've said is true, that if speculative posthumanism is true, then we want to, in a sense, understand what is out there in posthuman possibility space. But it might be that the only way to do that is to pursue the kinds of technologies which would generate posthumans. So actually, if we could skip a slide, because I don't want to over-egg the complexity. Yeah, so this is kind of what I mean by the posthuman predicament. That I think in some ways Hales goes too far when she suggests that we're already posthuman, and certainly in terms of the kind of conceptual geography that I'm developing in the book, we're not. We're human, but I think it's fair to say that that we could be in something like a posthuman predicament. That is, that we belong to very complex technological systems which seem to be developing in ways that no individual or even no government or corporate actor can ultimately control. These technologies may have effects that we can't easily predict. For example, you know, a lot of the base protocols that underlie the internet were developed so that physicists in a small community in Switzerland could view data on each other's computers. You know, HTML, the use of metadata to view files on different machines running different operating systems. Arguably, nobody could have predicted when that technology was being developed that this would develop into a world-embracing technology that everybody would be using on a daily basis. So, you know, one of the ideas is technology is very hard to predict. The way technology develops is very hard to predict. There are lots of different technologies in development, and it's very hard to know how they'll develop. Perhaps some of them, as I say, might be disconnection potent. That is, they might be capable of generating a disconnection event. So we seem to be in a situation where it's at least conceivable that some of the stuff that's happening now could give rise to something like a posthuman. And yet, so that's our predicament. And yet, if I'm right, we may be in the dark about what this could herald. And that seems to be an ethical problem, and it seems to be a political problem. So I don't know. I kind of feel like I ought to pause here because the PowerPoint, there's only a couple more slides anyway, and we've got about 20 minutes left, if I'm right. And others might want to chip in here, and yeah. Don't know if anybody's got any questions about this stuff. I mean, I should say that this is stuff that I talk about in the second half of the book, particularly towards the end of the book, and to my mind, it's the least satisfactory part. Yeah, thanks, Eric.
Hey, you can hear me?
Yeah, hi.
Cool, okay. Cool. Hey, really interesting stuff. First off, I just want to quickly ask about. You sort of had two trajectories that you were talking about, and I think we've covered the sort of the empirical and the technological that sort of get us to the posthuman, and we've talked, I think, a lot about the technological, and I'm wondering if you can talk. To me, it's really interesting. I haven't really heard anything quite like an approach that still tries to talk. Maintain a kind of empiricism. I guess maybe part of this, as far as I understand your dark phenomenology, there's something about a kind of radical empiricism in there, Maybe this is related in some way?
I don't use that term, but it's a nice way of putting it.
Okay.
It's a kind of naturalism, I suppose. I argue that, I mean, the idea of dark phenomenology is that there are certain states, conscious states, that we have, or structures of conscious states, like very fine-grained sensations, like very fine gradations of differences between colour or pitches in sound. That would be one example. Or perhaps the deep structure of our experience of time, which we have those experiences, but having them doesn't necessarily give us an insight into their nature. So do we know, for example, that there are, I don't know, 2 million shades of colour that we can actually experience? I'm not sure. Or do we know that the experience of time is something like, for example, phenomenologists like Husserl tell us it is, that it has a three-phase structure, a kind of immediate recollection of the past, a kind of immediate impression of the now, and a sort of anticipation of the future. I'm not sure if we know that, or I mean, what I'd suggest is that we can produce theories, and in a sense what people like Husserl and other phenomenologists have done is actually produce more theories of our phenomenology, but it's not clear whether, I mean, we can, as I said, I want to look at the argument in detail in the final session, but my argument is that if those structures are anything like what they tell us they are, then we can't use first-person reflection to understand them totally. We can get some idea about them, but we also need to use other techniques. So we may use, I don't know, we may need to do stuff like simulate the experience of time or the perception of time using recurrent neural networks, that kind of thing, or do empirical work on how people actually represent sounds in the brain, or simply respond to different gradations of pitch, that kind of thing. So it's the idea that, in a sense, we're not subjects. We don't have a privileged kind of ability to understand our own consciousness, and that means, and I guess, that's highlighted in some of the examples that Thomas Metzinger produces of very weird states of consciousness, or weird kind of pathological states, such as Anton syndrome, where you have people who claim, who due to a lesion of their visual cortex are blind. They can't see anything, but they don't know they're blind. They insist they can see. And from an armchair point of view, it seems that that's inconceivable. How could I not know that I'm blind if I'm blind? It's almost impossible to imagine what that's like. But if Metzinger's right, and if my more modest position is right, then it stands to reason that there are certain conscious states that we can't imagine, because we don't really have a huge amount of insight into our own conscious states. That we have them, but it doesn't mean that we know what they really are. That's the idea. So that means that our ability to kind of make claim, or the grounds on which we can make claims about possible minds, or at least possible forms of consciousness, is perhaps much thinner than some other philosophers might claim. So that's one of the kind of basis for the kind of unbounded posthumanism that I was talking about.
Right. So on the one hand, we have this sort of like the technologies themselves as they sort of evolve, and in this case, it's sort of, you're describing sort of the limits of our abilities with experience, the limits of empiricism, of phenomenology. Sort of we top out at some point, and that kind of then will maybe begin to map out this sort of negative space of the empirical, which in turn will be sort of this post-human space on some level. that this case we can't quite arrive at, we can't quite fully comprehend.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the whole of the, I'm inclined to say the whole of the first part of the book is a process of self-mortification or even self-flagellation. I'm trying to kind of strip away as much of. The assumption is that the assumption is that a lot of people who've talked about the future have illusions about what we can know about the future, and I'm trying to strip some of those away. It's debatable how successful the process is, but I think it's at least it's worth doing, because it seems that, I mean, even if predicting how a technology like HTML will pan out is difficult, then predicting the nature of post-human life ought to be really, really hard, and we kind of need to get into the mindset. That mindset, we need to kind of at least be aware of our limitations and what those limitations imply about our own agency now, which is ultimately where this will come back. I think. But there's scope for a lot of disagreement about just how stupid and how ignorant we are. I mean, this is just the argument that the book develops. Yeah.
I just throw in one small further comment. What's interesting, one particular trajectory that's really interesting to me in how you're putting this together is, if you take someone like Hales, who has her notion of the post-human, there's very few references. I mean, there's sort of a philosophy of mind thing going on that's crossover, but she's very continental, right? Like the sort of background that she has and the sort of references that she generally draws upon, whereas your sort of the people that you draw upon are very analytic, and I find it really interesting that you're sort of crossing over into this territory but still using a lot of these people. I wonder if you could just comment a bit on that and maybe the difficulty of that, because I feel like the one thing that kind of comes to mind is that the sort of philosophy of mind territory, dealing with people like Davidson and maybe Brandom, and like there's a bit of space for that. But I mean, I imagine on the other hand that it's kind of difficult. That there's a post-human being something that I've never really, I sort of have training too in analytic philosophy, and this kind of concept wasn't there. So it's sort of like you have to make that bridge, right?
Yeah, I think the book has quite a lot of analytic philosophy or kind of stuff coming out of that sort of post-Quinean naturalism. It does have also quite a lot. I do talk about deconstruction, Derrida. There's quite a lot of Deleuze. I mean, it's probably the kind of deconstruction that kind of an analytic philosopher would sort of recognize as, halfway, kosher, or I don't know what the term would be. That's partly due to the way my reception and reading of that tradition, that I kind of translate it into terms that I feel I can do something with. But so, if we come back to dark phenomenology, actually the underlying argument for dark phenomenology I take from an early paper by Derrida on Husserl, Genesis and Structure, and schematically the argument is that you have two aspects of phenomenology. You have phenomenology as a method, as a doctrine of interpretation, and you have phenomenology as a kind of ontology, or as a set of claims about structure of experience. And I think what Derrida tries to argue, and I think it's an interesting argument, and you could debate about whether he succeeds, is that the doctrine of the ontology of phenomenology outruns the doctrine of interpretation. That if phenomenology is halfway as weird and complex as Husserl says it is, then it's not something we can easily know about. Certainly by doing phenomenology. So there's a kind of discrepancy between the doctrine of interpretation and the ontology, which means that the two kind of fly apart. And I think a lot of what Derrida's in his early philosophy is trying to do is kind of make this kind of intervention. So, well, that actually the structure of time is, for example, so elusive that, you know, I guess, you know, you blink and it's gone. You know, I think one of the chapters in Speech and Phenomena is called Signs and the Blink of an Eye. The moment of the now always escapes the reflecting subject, and if that's right, then we can never really understand its structure simply by sort of peering into ourselves or doing kind of conventional phenomenology. So Derrida kind of uses that as a sort of hinge, but I'm not necessarily doing deconstruction, but I think there's something in the structure of that argument that's very fruitful, which can, you know, you can use within different traditions, analytic philosophy, or, you know. So I also think that deconstruction and certain kinds of I guess more libidinal or materialist forms of continental thought are very helpful for thinking through the politics of this, because they're very sensitive to the particularity of events. You know, that if a disconnection could occur, it would be an event in the sense perhaps that Deleuze understands it. There's a particular configuration of forces which would be absolutely singular and perhaps in many ways unpredictable and unrepeatable, and that seems to be quite salutary. It means that, you know, it gets at the kind of realism that I'm trying to introduce about the future, that, you know, that it may outrun our ability to conceptualize it in advance. You know, so I think those, you know, I mean, Bakker thinks that I've introduced too much metaphysics here, but and that may be true, but I think it's quite useful for at least telling a story about how the future might elude us from our current position. And I think it's salutary to sort of at least think through the implications of that.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Eric. We got about 10 minutes left, if I'm right, so we, you know, it's probably... Annika. That's a really interesting question. Would we recognize the post-human when we encounter it? That's very, I think that goes very deep, because it really forces me to consider the sort of methodology that I'm working with here, because I've given you this very abstract formulation of the post-human, deliberately abstract formulation of the post-human, and yet it's not clear how that abstract formulation would map onto the world. Would we, you know, what can we imagine a situation, and probably this is where science fiction is quite useful, where we'd encounter something post-human. And it might be that there are lots of cases where, you know, we'd be dealing with quite ambiguous departures from the human, which are still kind of recognizably human. You know, and there's quite a lot of that in science fiction. I mean, you know, I talk a bit about you know, the Cylons in Battlestar Galactica. Well, they're kind of post-human, but they're kind of like us too. You know, they're kind of, you know, they're acutely limited in many ways, even though, you know, they can live forever. But their ability to think is not greatly enhanced, it seems. Or there may be certain kinds of post-human that would be actually quite unspectacular. Maybe some, you know, some little, you know, going back to Petra's point about the plastic, but maybe certain kinds of self-maintaining robot or life form that could just, I don't know, slush around in a lake somewhere, or a rubbish tip, you know, eating our crap, living off our crap, could exist in symbiosis with us without really changing the world in kind of like Skynet, just some bottom feed, some bottom feeder, would that be posthuman? Well, it might be, according to my account, and I don't know if that's a problem with it, but so I like the idea that there could be actually lots of ambiguous situations, that actually if something like a disconnection happens, we might not be sure exactly whether it's a disconnection. We might be the ones disconnecting in any case, in which case, so in some ways having a tension, but I think between the conceptual, the formal specification and the reality is probably quite fruitful. Just being aware of where the theory fails or just doesn't measure up is actually quite. I quite like that idea that that actually if you. All right, we may encounter the posthuman in some sense, but whether we'll know it's posthuman or not may be open to negotiation. I'm not bothered by that. I rather like that idea. Yeah, perhaps. I don't know why, but maybe that's something we could think about for next time, as a kind of supplement. I mean, I think next week I want to focus on the first 2 chapters of the book, which is kind of more on the critical side, I guess, and particularly looking at more detail at critical posthumanism. But we could certainly talk about that. I don't want to over-program things. If somebody could come up with a good candidate for a real posthuman, I'd be delighted. So, great. I'm probably, I mean, we needn't do this in any detail now, but I'll be looking around for volunteers, maybe a couple of volunteers to write, I know, a short response to something in the first 2 chapters. That could be the introduction, chapter 1 or chapter 2. My idea at the moment is to leave it entirely open what you respond to and how you respond to it. So you might want to take a particular bit of text and analyze it and query it, or you might want to take certain ideas within that come up within the first chapters and explore them in some way, or bring in some area of knowledge or activity that you're involved in, which bear on the material. So it's not going to be over-programmed. In a sense, yeah. So, but I think we can do that through the Classroom app. And if somebody really wants to do that, that'd be great. If you lie low, I might have to volunteer someone, but it shouldn't be too tough. Just really looking for slightly more elevated level of input, even than we've had today. Looking for 10-minute responses, right? Yeah, that's all. I think that's fine. I mean, the main, as I said, it could just be tackling one idea, one concept, one theme, in any way you want. I don't want to over-specify things, because I think it'd be more interesting if you can bring more of yourselves you bring to this, really. Okay. Yeah. Just to put a little like a stress on enrolled students that they should volunteer, because you'll have to do one throughout the 4 sessions, anyways. So. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It'll probably help, when it comes to doing the final paper, final assessed piece of work. Okay. But great. I think we are really winding down here. I know I'm winding down. I've got to. I think we're at the 2.5 hour mark. Yeah, there's a lot to go over. I'm sure everybody's going to go back through and Yeah, I've got to wind down to bed because it's 11:30 where I am. Yep.
So we could have further discussion if anybody has any questions that pop up, you know, after the fact, or if you're going back to the video, just post them in the classroom.
Yeah, and
If you don't know
I'll the PowerPoint, such as it is, will be posted up. If that's any help, you know, it
Yeah, I'm
just
gonna
kind of
post it.
maps out. You know, it'll probably make more sense now you've heard me gassing about it. You know, it's not really much use on its own. And we can sort out the, you know, who's going to talk next week, as I said, over the classroom app. I don't think I've got anything more I want to say other than to thank you all for turning up. I've really enjoyed this, and it's really nice to kind of have this exchange.
Thank you for teaching this, and I think this will be a great seminar. So
yeah, well, thanks, Tony. Thanks for your help, and